Many hundreds of years ago, a great theologian named St. Thomas Aquinas divided reality into two parts, the natural and the supernatural. At the same time, the natural sciences were changing until eventually the supernatural was forgotten. Today, we're going to talk about why. So, let's get started. So some years ago, I asked a theologian, an Orthodox theologian, if he thought that when Aquinas divided up reality into the natural and the supernatural, whether he had made a mistake in doing so. And I don't mean a mistake as in wrong thinking. I just mean a mistake in the sense that as human beings, when you divide things up, we tend to think of these things as two different things. That is, the natural and the supernatural did not make all of reality. It was supposed to be the natural and the supernatural together, but it became the natural against the supernatural. And eventually, the natural was seen to be more real than the supernatural. That's where the mistake is. During the same period, the natural sciences were rising in dominance in the university system. And this is the result of Galileo, Newton, and Descartes. They changed how we looked at the universe and changed our focus from all of reality. They also were working on this too, and they changed all of reality into just focusing on the material aspects of reality. Okay, so I would not say either of this thinking, either side, the theologian side or the science sides, were wrong to think this way. It led to some great advancements. However, it also led to thinking that the immaterial part of reality, the supernatural part of reality, no longer existed. And in fact, in the 20th century, there was a philosophy that flourished for a while called logical positivism. I cannot say that word. Anyway, you know what I mean. That said that anything that we don't have an answer to, anything that we can't measure, anything that we can't explain, simply doesn't exist. And although many people reject that philosophy today, so much of that thinking still goes on in our language and in our education system. So recently, I was watching a podcast by two young philosophers who both study theology too, and they're both atheists. And they indicated that they felt that materialism, the belief in just the natural part of reality, couldn't explain consciousness. And therefore, they felt that materialism wasn't enough, that there is some immaterial part of reality that has to explain consciousness. Basically, that's what they said. Now, this is very strange because they still think of themselves as atheists. In fact, one of them put it, all materialists are atheists, but not all atheists are materialists. Now, that's a new one for me because I have not ever encountered an atheist who wasn't strictly a materialist. Now, those are, if you're not familiar with all of those words, this might be a little difficult at first, but you'll get the hang of it as we go along. The first thing I want to do is go over a little bit of the history of it so we see how we got to this place. And now that we seem to be moving away from strict materialism, how we can properly talk about God again, at least approach the subject and reintroduce it into the universities as a way of seeing the whole of reality. So first, we're going to talk about what I call the 5 known unknowns. These are like the big mysteries of life. There are many of them, but these are the 5, I think, that help us to understand how this particular way of thinking developed. So after we talk about the 5 known unknowns, we're going to move on to Aristotle's 4 causes, and then to Newton's 2 causes, and then to Descartes' feelings. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about the experience of God. All right, so why do we need to talk about that? Because we have come to believe that if we don't sense a thing, it doesn't exist. Is it necessary to feel God's presence? Is it an experience that you can't explain? Or is it a rationale, a way of reasoning about reality? And we go into that in more detail, I think, in later videos, but we must begin to address it because for many people today, this is the question about discovering whether there is a God or not. First of the 5 known unknowns is reality is what it is and not some other way. Okay, so this seems like an obvious statement, but it wasn't until the Egyptians' development of language that we could even make such a statement. There are 2 verbs for to be in Egyptian. One of them can form participles and therefore express what is and what has been, a faculty which Latin did not possess. All right, that's from this book, Egyptian Religion. Okay, moreover, statements are also made in a finite form about existence. Thus, the well-known personal name when Aman means Aman exists. The same name usage is incidentally also present in the case of other deities, and the verbal form is varied so as to produce all kinds of such statements about existence. All right, now, if you're Christian, you're familiar with the Exodus story, and at one point the Pharaoh asked Moses, what is the name of his God? And he says, I am who am. This is an Egyptian formulation about existence. Many Christian theologians say that God, what Moses was saying to them was that God was the only one who could say that. Now, I'm not really sure about that because really the logic involved in that happened with the Greeks, but after some time after some time of development of the Christian religion with Greek philosophy, that would be the understanding of it as God as the first mover. Okay, so all of this is very complicated, and we're really not going to get into this today. I'm going to have a whole video on each one of these things. I just want to get through them right now as an introduction. All right, the second known unknown is time is not a clock and space is not a ruler. Today in science, we tend to conflate time as the actual time and space as actual space as measurements of time and space. We have all kinds of theories about what time and space are, but we really don't know. I can take something and an object and measure it. And we say that it takes up a certain space, okay, a length and width and volume. It has dimensions in space. I can cut that thing in half. But I have not affected space. Or at least I have no idea whether I have affected space. Same thing with time. Time is not a clock. I'm not sure that that's obvious to the modern thinker, that time and space are things that we cannot observe. Therefore, we have very little to say scientifically about them. So I've said before that physics is very imprecise in its language. And we tend to talk about things as if we know what they are, but really they're just the things that we measure. We don't know what time is at all. We don't know what space is at all. We talked about curved space. We talk about asymmetrical clocks and aging, in the relativity theory, but they don't have any ontological meaning that we can be sure of. By ontological, I mean physical, real physical meaning. They are mathematical constructs, and we interpret them to mean things, but we don't actually know. Okay, so I'm going to say a bunch of math and physics things here, and if you don't understand it, that's fine. I just want to explain a little bit about why this is a problem for modern thinking, and I will expand on this in a future video. Okay, so when you're studying physics and you're in a math class for calculus, before you begin calculus, I was taught anyway about Zeno's paradoxes. All right, so Zeno's paradoxes. It says here in Wikipedia that there are a series of philosophical arguments presented by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea. The point of these was that he was devising these paradoxes to support Parmenides' philosophy of monism, which basically says that despite our sensory experiences, reality is singular and unchanging. It's easier to understand dividing up the space paradoxes. This one is about time. The point of which usually is taught before you start calculus is that we can't actually divide space and time up into points. That's not a reality. It means that we don't understand what space and time consist of, and therefore we can't make precise statements about it. But then in calculus, what do? We decide that we can measure distances, change in distances, and we can measure changes in time. And that's what we're going to work with, the measurements of time and space, not actual time and space. That's the distinction. When we are talking about positions in space, we are talking about dimensionless points. And usually when we are talking about these things, we are talking about moving from one point to another. Now we know we can't actually work with exact positions in space in reality. So we know what we are measuring is an approximation. All right. But when we talk about a change in position, say from this 0, 0, 0 position up to this X, Y, Z position, we talk about an object moving through space to this position, to a new position. So, and here we have a graph of time and space. When we talk about relativity, we are graphing all of space along either a single line or here we have a surface. All right, we're missing one dimension. This is why it's called a hypersurface. Okay, so here we're looking at a space versus time graph. And this is what we get as space-time in relativity theory. In relativity theory, we again have these points in space, but we have an added dimension of time. So now, in addition to graphing dimensionless points along a graph, we now have a dimensionless points of time along the graph. All right. So again, we are doing something that we don't actually experience. We don't actually experience a single point in time or space. Okay, let's go back to this other graph that I have, but just the 3 dimensions of space, no time added into it. And I say once again that we move from this 0, 0, 0 position to this X, Y, Z position. The mechanism by which we move is time. Now we're back to this. So the question here is, if we're slicing up time and space together, what is the mechanism of change? It's not clear to me that there is a way to move from one position on here to the other. We say we move over time, but what does move mean? These are all these positions along this time axis are points in time, not measurements in time. So this causes confusion because what it produces is, again, you see the past light cone and the future light cone. This is saying the same thing that Zeno was saying, is that there is no motion, there's no time. That time is an illusion, all right, and that we simply exist from moment to moment. This goes against our observations of reality. Okay, we are accepting Zeno's paradox that at every instant of time, there is no motion occurring. If everything is motionless at every instant and time is entirely composed of instants, then motion is impossible. Now, Aristotle rejected that, at least up to the time of Einstein. This idea of motion being impossible, change being impossible, was not accepted. All right. Here's the issue here. I've said before, there's nothing wrong with this math, but does it have any real physical meaning about our reality? I'm sure that there are some physicists who understand that this is a mathematical construction, an abstract construction, and does not have a basis in reality. And I'm sure that you have seen in many, many videos about physics how it's confusing to the physicists. And all I am saying is that if it's confusing for the physicists, what is everybody else supposed to do? All right. Moving on. Number 3 of the 5 known unknowns is something must die so that I may live. And I really believe that this is the beginning of the religious understanding. This is the understanding that all living things perform a sacrifice of some sort. The first level of life, plant life, does not have any animal characteristics, we know, and takes its nutrition from the sun and the soil, non-living things. At that lowest level, there's less understanding that something is sacrificing because they're not self-aware. Plants are not self-aware. And I think this is the basis of veganism today. All right. However, there's still sacrifice involved. The plant must die. Rocks don't die. They maintain their form. We don't eat rocks. We may break them up, but they have no living component to them. But plants do. And so I understand people wanting to give up meat and fish and all of that to respect life in all its forms. But the thing is, you're still taking the life of a plant. And I agree, it's the least destructive of nature around us. However, I think that if it's used to avoid this idea of sacrifice that is part of our reality, then it's a mistake. If you're vegan and you're listening to this, I'd really like to hear about that and the reasoning behind it. This difference between living things and its dependence on other living things is part of the division between the living and the non-living. It's an important distinction. And finally, why it's a known unknown, because it's that all seems rather known, is why. Why must it be this way? All right, now the fourth one has to do with the mystery of evil. As cold is a lack of heat, perhaps evil is a lack of good. That's the way I look at it. Other people feel that evil is an actual presence or person. All right, but this is another known unknown. What is evil? Okay, it's separate from the suffering one because you can suffer from a natural event or for lack of air, water, and food, and it doesn't involve a malevolent person involved or spirit. All right, and finally, number 5, faith believes no one dies alone. Doubt believes everyone dies alone. And this, again, is the mystery of our afterlife, the mystery of a personal God, or reincarnation, all of these things that we talk about after we die. All right, what happens to us after we die? Okay, yeah, this is such a loaded topic. I could be talking about this one all day too, but I'm trying to keep it within the context of our original goal, which is to understand why, how we got to the point where universities have trouble talking about God, whether he exists or doesn't exist. We try to avoid the subject altogether because it leads to. We're avoiding the subject as if it's either settled in some way or not worthy of discussion, when it really is at the top of many people's minds, and I think many people are depressed over it. All right. The reason why I have put this here is because I believe that all religions, not just theistic religions, not just ones that believe in a God, but all religion tries to answer this question in a positive way. And the one thing that they seem to all have together is that no one dies alone. Whatever you are, whatever death leads to the next level, there is someone or thing waiting for you. Many of them are ancestral religions, and that that your ancestors are there waiting for those who have gone before you, your friends, your family, your animals. They're all there. Now, that's where I am. I actually believe that. I have been an atheist in the past. I sometimes slip into atheistic thinking. It's very hard to get rid of because all of our training is toward this. And this is what this video is about. This is about showing how we got to a point where we have difficulty letting thoughts of a creator in. All right. So let's go on. So this is where we want to go with these 5 unknowns. We know there's a reality. We know that we don't understand all of it. And that's exemplified by time is not a clock and space is not a ruler. No matter how we think about it, no matter what we measure, we're still never going to know what time and space are. We are finite beings living within space and time, and we're just never going to fully understand that. All right. The third one is something must die so that I may live. This is a mystery of our life. Why do living things need sacrifice in order to survive? The fourth one is that evil exists and we don't understand why either. Why would a loving God allow evil? All right, there are many answers to that. The fact is, it is a part of reality and cannot be wished away. And no matter how we rationalize it, it still exists and is painful. All right. And then number 5, faith believes no one dies alone. Doubt believes everyone dies alone. So the atheistic, and I'm going to call it a faith, atheistic faith, because it's a belief, not something that's known. It's not a fact. All right. Faith believes, doubt believes. All right. That's my formulation for this. These 5 unknown unknowns are things that we tend to forget in our arguments for and against a creator, for and against religion, for and against allowing these discussions into the classroom. I have another book called The Quest for Eternity by J.C.A. Gaskin. This is a very good book. He does lay out a case why atheism is less likely to be true than, a creator of some sort. However, he still is an atheist, and this is something that I want to talk about today too. Why, even if we convince our head that something is true, we cannot convince our heart that something is true. All right, and so this is why this is a war, but inside of us all the time. One more thing I want to say about Gaskin and the Quest for Eternity. He believes it may be a personality trait, whether you believe in God or not. I tend to think that it's not just your personality, but also your mental health and, whatever trauma that you've suffered, where you are in that stage of recovery. And I also think it has to do with culture. But again, these are things that we're going to talk about in later videos, but it is very important. All right. These 5 known unknowns are very difficult for modern man to get their heads around. And I understand that. So we tend to push them to the back of our minds and try not to think about them. Some of them, I'm sure people are not even aware of, that they remain questions. So how did we get there? Because this was not the case for ancient cultures or even medieval cultures. This is a modern problem. So now we're going to move on to Aristotle's 4 causes. So the reason we started with the 5 known unknowns is that we need to understand the shift in thinking from ancient cultures to modern cultures. In ancient cultures, those unknowns were more, I think, more accepted than they are today as part of the conversation. And today we just put them aside and pretend they don't exist. And I think part of that is because we've come to view the physical universe as a machine, and we view humans as and animals as biological machines. That's why these gears are in front of our beautiful statue of David here. And as we've talked about before, David represents, the statue of David represents our telos section in the memory palace. So we're going to remove the machinery in front of the statue, and there he is in all of his naked glory. And this is the way ancient man viewed himself, as a body and a spirit, right? It wasn't controlled by machinery or some kind of physical machinery. All right, so we're just going to look at him that way for a little bit. So we're going to talk about Aristotle's 4 causes right now. Let's take, for example, this table represented here. The first cause is a material cause. That is, what is the table made of? And that is represented by the wood here. The second cause is how the table was created, and that's represented by the tools. The third cause is the formal cause. This is what form the matter takes. When the person creating the table creates it in a particular way, this is called its form. All right, and it's flat with some legs holding it up. That's its form. And the fourth cause is the final cause, or the purpose, and that is to dine on. All right, we put our food on it, or we write on it. We use it for a lot of things. All right, but those are the final causes, what we are going to use the table for. Now, in the same way, ancients viewed ourselves, that we are made of something, some substance, that we were created, it's from some process, that we had a particular form, and that form was not one that we thought of ourselves, but comes from some other source that created us. And our final cause, our final purpose, which is related to the idea of telos, is the reason why we're here. We did not bubble up from the ground completely. Some outside force or creator, as you want to call it, had a purpose for us. This is a good book, Aristotle for Everyone, because just talking about it for a few minutes is not going to help you to understand this if this is your first time being exposed to Aristotle's ideas. Because Aristotle lived at a time before there was a scientific inquiry, that is, we set up experiments to test out our hypothesis, science was more along the lines of observation and speculation. So one of the things that Aristotle thought was has to do with gravity. He felt that if you picked up an object and you dropped it, the reason why the object fell to the ground was because that is its final cause. It was meant to be on the ground. All right, and he felt that, he believed also that the more matter or mass an object had, the faster it would fall. Now we know when Galileo came along, there's the legend that he dropped two heavy balls of different weights from the Tower of Pisa, and they both fell to the ground at the same time. And he probably didn't do that. He probably used a rolling incline and rolled them down, and found that they rolled at the same rate. So that's probably where that came from. But that's a correction to Aristotle. All right, so Aristotle was incorrect about the final cause of gravity. All right, the final cause of an object falling to the ground. And this is where, between Galileo and Newton, you start to come up with these ideas about the force of gravity. So Aristotle additionally divided these four causes into two sets, one intrinsic and the other extrinsic. Intrinsic means it having to do with the object itself, and extrinsic having to do with outside forces. So the intrinsic aspects of the actual object, the material and the form of the material, those were properties of the thing itself. The efficient and final causes came from outside the object. But what I want to point out here is that the reason why the ball falls to the ground, Aristotle thought was a final cause. But really what caused it to fall to the ground, was an efficient cause. It was the act of an outside force on the object. It's not that the four causes went away. It's just that the causes for something to happen changed in our understanding. All right, so because of this new thinking, Newton said, if you want to track motion of objects, you didn't need to consider the form or the final causes. Because of this, Newton said that in order to track motion, we only need to consider the material and the efficient causes to write our equations for the motion of an object. Okay. He did not say that there were not formal or final causes for that object. He said simply that in science, you only needed to consider the material and the efficient causes, all right, to understand the motion. It did not explain the whole why of the object. It just described the motion. Somehow in our modern thinking, we have reinterpreted that to say that there are no formal or final causes because we don't have to be concerned about them. So this is how we are moving from four causes to two causes. We are not completely out of the four causes at the time of Newton. This happens subsequently to Newton's time, because when you're taught this in school, it's taught that Aristotle was wrong. But I think that it's not explained very well in what ways Aristotle was wrong, and that we have simply forgotten that there might be a final and formal cause to humanity. Because of the great success of Newton's equations, we enter into a burst of scientific activity and experimentation, and eventually into the industrial age, where the machine looms large in our imaginations. Okay, it's this constant creativity that goes on, and invention is just mind-boggling. And because it is such a success, Newton's ideas about science become our philosophical ideas about reality. So how do we get to this point? That we think of man as a machine, that somehow through the chaos of the universe developed from inanimate material to animate material, and then finally self-awareness. And so now we're going to put the machinery back in front of David here. All right, now he's all covered up. All right, so how do we get there? All right, so here we are over at the Thinker. Get off of this. Okay, so we have the dead tree and the Thinker on the other side. These are symbolisms for Descartes. All right, so I'm calling this section Descartes' feelings. Not that I think Descartes made a mistake about feelings, but I think that the misinterpretation of what Descartes was actually saying led to this idea that only our feelings are valid. That is not what he said, but that is how we've come to interpret it. The idea of his cogito, that I think, therefore I am, led people to believe that thinking proved their existence, and what they thought was more important than the reality around them. The reason why Descartes was so important is that at the time that he developed this thinking, and for some time afterwards, it was believed that all of reality could be understood by this building up of axioms, okay, little truisms that we know for sure. I think, therefore I am, became I think, That's my proof of existence. That's my first axiom. And from there, I can build up a whole understanding of the physical nature of the universe and my place in it. All right. It was so prevalent in the 20th century. There was a belief that mathematics, even being the most factual of our sciences, was we would be able to prove all of our math from these little axiomatic beginnings. All right. In fact, this was pursued by Whitehead, and he tried to develop. I think he proved after 600 pages that 1 + 1 = 2. All right, 600 pages to prove that 1 + 1 = 2. Okay, so that's a lot to get to one small statement that we accept. But then a little bit later on, Gödel came along with his incompleteness theorem and proved that formal systems, as Whitehead was trying to develop, were incomplete. And this pretty much destroyed this thinking that we could develop everything from the ground up. And you would think that would be the end of it, but it is not. We still believe in some way that we can develop an understanding of reality from studying subatomic particles and understanding all of the forces on those particles. And I think it will be a long time before we are able to rid ourselves of this understanding. This is so ingrained in us from Descartes, who believed that man would be able to understand all of reality. And this is a lovely vision, but I don't believe it's possible. So here we are back at the stone garden. And you notice that the stone table is on a cross or plus sign. Okay, and this is going to represent our horizontal and vertical lines of thinking. All right, so basically, let's say that the horizontal line represents the two causes of Newton, the material and the efficient causes. And the vertical is our formal and final causes. This is a part of human thinking. We sometimes get confused between what's real and what isn't, especially as we're mapping out our environment and our thinking. All right. We confuse the thoughts with things itself that we're thinking about. And we've known this for a long time about ourselves, that we could get these things confused. So today, in modern times, we don't think about the vertical. We don't think about the formal and final causes. And yet these questions come up. So the only answer, if you are only considering material and efficient causes, okay, in the creation of an object, it can only work from the ground up. All right, that is, smaller things become more complex things. Particular things become whole things. And so this idea of emergence has come about, that the universe has in some way created itself, that there is no formal or final causes coming from outside the universe. And so therefore, only these higher forms of existence, from non-living to living creatures could only happen through some upward process from forces within the universe. And this is why we cannot consider a God in our reality, because we have blocked out those other two causes. They're not part of our thinking anymore. When we go to them, we think of them as being, this is where our supernatural and natural come from. The vertical line represents the supernatural, the horizontal represents the natural. But if you come to believe that only the natural exists and not the supernatural, or the material line exists, but not the immaterial, which simply means the stuff that is outside of matter, all right, then you can never consider a creative force or a design on the universe. And I'm not talking about intelligent design yet. That's something different. So as I started this video, I said I was talking to this theologian. And that's how this whole line of thinking came to me. And he agreed that it was probably a mistake to separate the natural from the supernatural, because it's all natural. All right. There's really there is no separation. There's only the separation of the physical motions that we were talking about. It didn't mean that everything else disappeared from reality. But certainly St. Aquinas could not have seen that that was going to happen. At the same time, if this thinking of separating out the horizontal plane from the vertical plane, okay, didn't happen, we wouldn't have the things we have today. We wouldn't have our airplanes and our washing machines, anything else that's mechanical that we have, our computers, whatever. And I certainly wouldn't want to go back to not having those things. At the same time, we need to reintegrate the rest of reality into our thinking so that we can move forward, because we've hit a wall in this line of thinking. We need to go back. And I want to show this by showing a little clip from Sabine Hossenfelder on her thinking about theology.
Is the present determined by the future? The idea that our universe and everything in it has a secret plan, a goal that we inevitably have to reach, is called teleology. This sounds strange, if not outright crazy, and a little bit depressing. I mean, what if the goal of the universe is to produce apple pie and we're just a step on the way? But the idea of teleology keeps popping up in physics, and apple pie or not, today I want to try and convince you that we should take it more seriously. We're used to the causes being in the past, not in the future, and that's an expectation which is baked into the maths that we use in physics. All our current theories work with differential equations that have a particular property. If you feed these equations with a full description of what happens at one moment in time, you can use the equations to calculate everything that happens before and after that. The full description of one moment is called the initial state. Usually you choose it to be the present, and then you calculate what happens in the future. Say you specify where you shoot an arrow and at what angle and speed, and then you calculate where it lands. That'd be a typical use of those equations. You can also use an initial state in the past, for example in the early universe, and then you check whether the prediction from that past state agrees with what we observe today. This is how we test our theories for the early universe. In principle, you could also choose an initial state in the future. In practice, though, this brings up the problem that, well, you don't know what the future is. It's also mathematically a somewhat meaningless procedure, because we know that the universe at present is somehow. Right? I mean, that seems like maybe one thing we can all agree on. The universe has got to be somehow. And the equations are so that the future is determined by whatever the present is already. You can't just add another condition in the future that will just generally not be fulfilled. So it appears as if there's no space for teleology in our current theories. But you can think of using other types of theories, other mathematical frameworks in which the present state doesn't fully specify the future, and where a teleological requirement actually does tell you something new. And maybe it's what physics needs to make progress.
All right, so you see that for this little clip, I mean, you can watch the rest of it. It's fine if you're into physics. You'll probably want to watch the rest of it. It's very interesting. But you see that she can only see things as they come up from the bottom. Things. The final cause is some final cause in the future. You can see how this thinking resulted from this progression of ideas. All right. So we need to reincorporate them back in, and then things will perhaps have meaning again. The meaning exists, the telos exists, the essence of a thing exists before the thing exists, not afterwards. It's not, we do not, we bring meaning to our lives by the things that we do. This is true. However, we had meaning beforehand. This is a whole nother subject about essence and something to be talked about later on. So the last thing we want to talk about is this feeling the presence of God, that needs to be the thing that convinces us that God is real. All right, now I think that by showing how we have reduced our understanding of reality to only pretty much what goes on between our ears, I think as many philosophers understand that that's not so, but so much of our science is more concerned about what's going on up here rather than what's going on outside of us. There's more to reality than our feelings or convincing ourselves that we ourselves exist. I have one more book, Mortimer J. Adler's 10 Philosophical Mistakes. One of these mistakes, let me read the subtitle here. Basic errors in modern thought, how they came about, their consequences, and how to avoid them. Okay, so I'm sure other philosophers have talked about this. Mortimer J. Adler's been gone for many years now. He addresses this particular problem of how we know things from not just ourselves, but from our experience of living with other people. It's worth reading, and it would take too long in this video to go over that particular error in thought. But our belief in things comes from outside of us too, not just the things we experience with our senses and what goes on up here, okay, or our feelings. So it's not that I don't want to say that people don't experience the presence of God. It's just that in more ancient times, when we had a broader understanding of reality, or at least a broader scope of reality than we do today, it wasn't, our hearts were more able to accept God as existing, whether or not we felt we had a personal experience with the Creator or not. All right. I don't believe that it is necessarily a Christian thing. From what I've read in different religions, it is a universal thing. It is interpreted by our brains culturally. Does that mean I don't think Christianity is true? No, that is not what it means at all. And that, again, is a subject matter for another video, okay? There'd be too much to get into right now. I personally believe that everyone experiences God. I think because of our way that we approach reality, we don't recognize that it's happening. That's not and I'm not saying that it's a false consciousness. I'm just saying we reject it. From what I have read about people's conversions, it is after the conversion that they recognize that this supernatural presence has been with them the entire time. Those who are interested in this idea that God may exist continue on. There is some truth to the idea that if you go looking for God, just as you go looking for Buddha, you're going to find him. And then you're going to realize that your image of God, or your image of the Buddha, or enlightenment, or however it is formed in other religions, is not what you thought it was at all. And then you'll know. And that's all I can say about that. All right. It's probably not enough, and I'm sorry for that. I wish I could give an experience of God to each and every person so that they could move forward in that relationship. The one universal that comes out of these experiences with the supernatural is that we do not die alone. Perhaps that's the best comforting thing that I can offer for those who do not feel the presence of God. So, in conclusion, I hope that you see from this progression of thought that we have kind of closed down our view of reality to this horizontal level, and that is not all there is to our reality. This was good for advancements in technology, right? But it's been bad for our overall mental health, right? I don't think it's good to think that everything is going to end, that there's nothing beyond the physical plane. I don't think successful civilizations have ever not had some unifying idea about an afterlife for us, that we continue on in some manner. All right. That's a subject again for another day, but I think it would go a long way to improving mental health in this culture if we could find a way back to the vertical plane of reality. Okay. All right. That's all for now. See you next time.